that's cool since we're in at 7. My name's Katie Borick. I'm a family medicine physician and the co-director of the LGBTQ clinic. So y'all are the Dance Marathon Empowerment team.
Yes.
So is this like all the DEI, or like tell me what this means?
We have, so this is basically, I'm a chair on the DEI committee, and I run this little group of, I think it's all leadership members right now, just people from different committees. We have some required members and then some that choose to join,
Yeah.
just to learn about different DEI initiatives and how to make our organization more inclusive.
And how often do you meet?
We meet once a month.
Oh, very fun. Well, thank you for having me. Thank you so much. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about, okay, good, it's moving. It's not moving here, it's moving here, good. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about our LGBTQ plus clinic, and hopefully get done with this in about a half an hour and have some time for questions if y'all have some. So I'm the co-director of the clinic with my partner, Dr. Nicole Nisley. She's a general internal medicine physician. She's retiring from the university actually the end of this year. So it makes me sort of sad. We've had about a 10-year partnership. So the clinic's been open since October 2012. We've cared for probably somewhere around 10,000 patients. And when I think about when the clinic started, I was just finishing up my residency, so I did my medical school training here at Iowa, and I was lucky enough to stay on as a family medicine resident, so 3 years after medical school. And I knew that I was going to join faculty here then after my residency. So I was just finishing up, and Dr. Nisley, she approached me and said, hey, they're making us do an evening clinic at this new building at Iowa River Landing. So y'all know where IRL is, right? And so she said, and if we have to do an evening clinic, I want to do something fun. I want to do an LGBTQ plus clinic. And I'd only known Dr. Nisley because she taught me in medical school, so I remembered her from some lectures. And I said, oh my goodness, that sounds like something I could do when I'm like old and gray and have all of this like, you know, pent up political capital that I could spend to do something this cool. And she said, well, I am old and gray and I have that political capital and I want to do it. Do you want to do it with me? And so I said, yeah, let's do it. And so it took us about 6 months. We met with hospital attorneys, we met with department chairs, and kind of tried to talk to people about the need for this. And they sort of said like, well, okay, but if no one comes, you're still gonna like see people that have sore throats and colds and stuff, because that's kind of what they were doing in this evening clinic, which is kind of like a walk-in. Like, you know, it's 7 o'clock, you don't want to go to the ER, you want to go somewhere, you could go to this evening clinic. And so we said, yeah, we would see whoever wanted to see us if we didn't have any LGBTQ plus patients. And that did not happen, right? So we've seen 10,000 patients in the last 10 years. And I think that a lot of folks think like, well, of course, because we live in Johnson County, Iowa. And you're like walking down the street and all of a sudden, you know, somebody that's queer jumps out from behind a bush and you pick up a rock and you see somebody else, because they're just everywhere because we're in Iowa City. And so maybe, but the reality is though is that like 70% of our patients come from outside of Johnson County. So they're coming from rural Iowa to come see us. They're driving sometimes 4 or 5 hours because we are providing them with the kind of medical care that they just unfortunately haven't been able to find locally. So we started with primary care, so that's kind of like your PCP, your primary care physician or primary care provider. So I'm a family medicine doc, so see patients of all ages. Nicole Nisley is a general internal medicine, so sees adults. And then we have expanded that to having more primary care providers, both in internal medicine and in family medicine, as well as some folks in OBGYN and in pediatrics. We've added on some specialty care, including some surgeries. So we have partners in urology that would do things like a vaginoplasty or the creation of a new vagina, or a phalloplasty, which is the creation of a penis. We have a lot of business that we give to plastic surgery. Our most kind of common surgery for transgender folks would be male chest reconstruction. So when we have people who identify as trans masculine or trans men, Often they have a lot of dysphoria with their breasts or with their chest. And so the creation of kind of that like more masculine or male appearing chest is probably the most kind of common surgery that we have done for our transgender patients at UIHC. We have partners in psychiatry and psychology from a mental health perspective. And where we started just on Tuesday nights at IRL, we have providers across the hospital and across a lot of our clinics. At the main campus at IRL, I practice out at Scott Boulevard, which is like by Blackstone, at that location, so multiple locations every day a week. So this is kind of how it all started, kind of more than 10 years ago. There was a group on campus called Trans Collaborations, and I don't know that they're active anymore, but it was like a student org that had organized a number of events for Transgender Awareness Week, and one of those events was a healthcare panel, and so that's where Dr. Neisler and I both went, unbeknownst to the other that we were going to be there, and we listened to, I think, 3 or 4 trans and gender diverse people talk about their experiences in healthcare, specifically their experiences that they had had at UIHC. And we were both really moved by their stories, and although we knew that we wanted to make a clinic that could serve kind of all queer folks and all LGBTQ+ people, it really was those people who had the hardest time receiving that kind of healthcare that they deserve, meaning the transgender and gender diverse people. That was the impetus for us starting the clinic. So I want to just briefly talk to you about some language and some terms and definitions. This will be sort of like, if there's anything to kind of learn from this, hopefully you might learn a little bit. Maybe it's review. If you have any questions, you can stop me now and ask me, or we can talk about them afterwards too. But one of the things that Nicole and I had the opportunity to do when we had decided that we wanted to open a clinic was we knew that we had to be intentional around asking the population or the folks who were within the population that we wanted to serve what they actually wanted, like what would make sense to them in terms of being in a space that felt really safe for them to receive healthcare. So we had the opportunity to do some focus group sessions with people from the University of Iowa, the kind of Iowa City community at large, that identified, kind of throughout the spectrum, but a lot of folks that were trans or gender nonconforming. And one of the things that really, I think hit home for both of us was just how very, very important that language is, and how it is like our privilege as people who are not transgender that we can take for granted the language that people use kind of every single day. When you talk about people, when you talk to them, that we just kind of speak freely and don't necessarily think about it. And so being really mindful with what our language is and the importance of it was kind of the foundation and where everything started. So I used to deliver babies as a family doc. That's one thing that we do. Super fun. I stopped about 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago now, for a multitude of reasons. The number one being that babies are born in the middle of the night, and it's after a fairly long time, and I got pretty tired of doing it and all sorts of stuff. So hung that up, but when I did deliver babies, there would be times where the parents wouldn't, during that kind of 20-week ultrasound, find out what the sex of their baby was. And so it was a surprise. And so I would be the one that would assign the sex at birth. And so what I used to think of as sort of just sex, just one word, I now really think of as sort of sex assigned at birth or assigned sex at birth. You might see it kind of written or hear it both ways. And the way that I would do that would typically be I would look at the baby's genitals, right? And I would say it's a boy or it's a girl. I wouldn't ever do a cheek swab and run a karyotype to figure out what their chromosomes were. I wouldn't get an ultrasound and look at the gonads and try to figure out what their internal organs were. I would just look at the external genitals and assign a sex at birth. We of course know that sometimes there are infants that are born with ambiguous genitalia. And sometimes when we have people that don't go through puberty as we would expect, or in the midst of a workup for something like infertility, that we find out that somebody is what we call intersex, And so old, outdated, not to be used term for that would be like hermaphrodite. Newer term, more acceptable, definitely intersex. You'll see it sometimes in the medical world as DSD, differences in sex development. So that's the other way that you can sort of see that. But even if you have a newborn that has ambiguous genitalia, by the time that they leave the hospital, they will have been assigned a sex at birth, either male or female. So this is really talking about kind of those chromosomes, reproductive organs, functions, kind of the biology of it. And then we have gender. And so the important thing about here is just that they're not the same. So sex and gender are not the same thing, okay? So sex is what we just kind of talked about. And then gender is really, really just this sense. So gender identity is one of those terms kind of under this umbrella of gender. But it is each person's personal sense of being a gendered being, okay? So then we have some other things that we could talk about with gender. Gender, you can express your gender. All of us made decisions this morning as to like how we would express our gender. Did we want to wear like pants or dress or skirt? Did we want to have like a full beard or shave it? Did we want to wear like, you know, walk down the street with firewood and a lumberjack like flannel shirt, right? All of these are ways that we would express our gender. How we wear our hair, do we wear makeup or jewelry, how do we use our hands? These are kind of what culture and society has decided for us is masculine or feminine. And then we similarly have gender norms, and that is what society and culture expects of kind of the roles that we all sort of play. So when I'm talking to folks who are in the medical field, I always ask for like all of the people who present as female and who are physicians or doctors, if they've been referred to as nurses on the hospital wards, and they'll say like, for sure. And I ask all the people that present as male, have you ever been referred to as a nurse? And they look at you like, I'm crazy, right? And that's just because what society expects, that the women are the nurses and the men are the doctors, right? So those are some of the kind of gender norms that we live in, kind of what society and culture places upon us. This gender identity, though, isn't what society or culture thinks. It's really what each person individually and uniquely identifies as with regard to their gender. Has anybody taken organic chemistry? Yes. So you know, like these little terms or these little things look familiar? Yeah. So, so these are like real. Do they still let you buy the models? You can like have them in your hand. I just love that so much because it's been a long time since I've taken organic chemistry, and I did have the little models, like a little, really, really nerdy kid, and I would like manipulate them with your hands to remember better. But so we have transgender. And so we have transgender men, trans women, non-binary folks, we'll talk about those. And instead of saying, okay, well, if you have somebody who's not trans, that you don't say like a normal man or a real man or a biologic man, we could just use like the opposite Latin term. Instead of transgender, we could just say cisgender. So trans means opposite side, and cis means same side. So you have a cisgender man or a cis man or a cisgender woman or a cis woman. So that means that you have somebody whose sex assigned at birth aligns with or is the same as their gender identity. So their sex assigned at birth was female and their gender is a woman, cisgender woman. And then conversely, you have someone who might be a trans woman, so their sex assigned at birth was male and their gender is female or a woman, so a transgender woman. So the transgender terms, sometimes you'll hear people say female to male or FTM, or male to female or MTF, and I get it, like that kind of makes sense in your mind. You're like painted a little picture, like you're like, here's where we're starting, here's where we're going, we're gonna end up on this other side. But I would encourage you to, instead of those terms, use things more like trans man or trans masculine or trans woman or trans feminine. And the reason is this, is that I think that when you say female to male, that you sort of, it's just hard not to kind of conjure up what then society kind of expects of those things. So that sort of is implying that you have someone who like starts over here as female, and she has breasts, and she has, really feminine features and a very Barbie-like gender expression and all the 9 yards. And then you don't end until her breasts become a male chest, her vagina becomes a penis, and she looks this way, this very masculine way. And that's sort of when it's all over. And the reality though is that trans people can be super, super different. And so we only do medical procedures or interventions or medicines to treat the dysphoria that someone has. And so I have some transgender people and all they need to treat their dysphoria is just to like change their name and their pronouns. And I have others who would socially transition, so they might change how they look. And I have others, I have a lot of them, who would say, I need to do those things for sure, but I also need to take hormones to better align my secondary sex characteristics with my gender. And then I have patients who do that, and they would socially transition, they would take hormones, and they might also say, I need surgical procedures to help align my primary sex characteristics with my gender. So it doesn't make one or another of them more or less trans than the other. Everybody, that I sort of talked about there is transgender. So saying male to female just kind of doesn't necessarily capture those folks who might not actually want what society would say you have to be a female. So saying trans, trans woman or trans feminine just gives them a little bit more space and is less kind of pigeonholey, I would say. And then you have this word called transition, and this is kind of just what that process is. So it's that process of moving from one gender to another. Importantly, some people may not identify as trans after transitioning to their affirmed gender. We ask people when they come to the LGBTQ clinic, we have them fill out a questionnaire just on MyChart, so on their phone or on the iPad, tablet when they come. And we ask them what their sex assigned at birth was. That one is pretty easy and straightforward. And then we ask them to choose their gender, and we give them a bunch of options. So we would say, man, woman, trans man, trans woman, non-binary, something else, and we just let them fill it in. And we will have a ton of patients who will choose trans man. And we would have a ton of patients who would have a sex assigned at birth female who would just choose man. And so if all that we asked was just what someone's gender is, then we may not know that that person has a uterus and has the potential to become pregnant. We need to ask about that before we do something like an x-ray, or before we're thinking about something like surgery, or before we're trying to figure out what's going on with their abdominal pain, right? So from a medical standpoint, it is really important that we're asking both of those questions and so we can figure it out. But I think also all of these things are just labels. And we think about labels in the medical field all the time because it's sort of how we conceptualize and how we kind of risk stratify and think about what kind of anticipatory guidance do we need to give for patients, what's on the differential diagnoses. And so, it's not just open lines where you get to fill it in, it's drop down boxes. That's how our electronic medical record works. And that's how our mind works too, is we want to categorize people with the labels that they give us. And importantly, we have to let them give us their own labels. So I think that it is important in some ways to really find out and ask somebody, just like you would want to ask them what name that they use and what pronouns that they use. It might also be helpful to just ask them do you have a term or word that you use to describe your gender? And maybe they would just say, yeah, I'm a man. You'd say awesome. Or they might say I'm a trans man, and you would say awesome. And if you are good enough friends with that person, or if you feel or if they give you that I'd be happy sharing something if you wanted to ask me questions. I think it's really interesting to kind of ask folks why they choose a specific label. I also, the only caveat to that is that we don't get to let trans people or LGBTQ plus people or black folks or people of color be the person to teach us everything. That's what the Google is for, That's what you can follow really cool people on TikTok and Instagram to learn this stuff first. If you have somebody in your life who is a gift like that, that's great. And that is a super impressively awesome thing that you could do to ask somebody why they particularly chose this or that label. And then similarly, pre-op and post-op, sometimes in a medical field especially, we would hear people say oh, this is a pre-op trans woman, which then implies that of course every trans woman wants to be rid of her penis and have a vagina, and that's just not the case. Some of them do, and some of them have no dysphoria with their genitals, they would never want that. So we should say if they're status post-vaginoplasty, because we want to know what organs that they have, but pre-op and post-op really don't make a lot of sense. Oh, let's see. Okay. So we talked about kind of our two binary options. So binary meaning two, we talked about trans women and trans men, or trans masculine and trans feminine people. And then so kind of the other bucket would be non-binary. And so non-binary is an umbrella term. Facebook at one time had, I think, 47 gender options, and 43 of them were non-binary terms. So people can identify as non-binary, just all by itself. And people can also identify as one of those more specific non-binary terms. So some of those might be genderqueer, third gender, androgynous, gender fluid. There's many, many more. Okay, so again, this is where folks might say like, yeah, I identify as whatever that it might be, genderqueer. And there are sort of very nuanced reasons that people may pick one or another of these terms. And so just like we may not use one of the kind of those binary terms, man or woman, they also may not use one of these binary pronouns like she or he. So most commonly, you would see somebody use something like they, them, theirs. We've seen a lot of folks doing kind of like she, they, or he, they, and that just means they would use either. So you could use she the whole time, you could use they the whole time, you could use she some of the time, they some of the time, in the same sentence if you wanted to. Usually it doesn't matter, they would be okay with either pronoun. Sometimes folks would say, I use all pronouns, it doesn't matter. And then rarely we have things, or I've seen some folks who would use things that would be a non-binary pronoun, z's, yours, years, me, and mears, some of those. And again, the only way to know is really just to ask. So ask someone what pronouns that they would like to use. And why is it important to use pronouns? This is a study on LGBTQ youth, specifically on transgender youth. And they looked at just if somebody who identifies as trans, and I forget what they used for an age range, if it was younger than 24, which is typically how they would sort of say like adolescent/youth. So all that they looked at is if they had someone in their life, if all or most of the people in their life versus a lot or some or a few or none, use their pronouns. And when you look at if someone has no one in their life who uses their preferred pronouns versus all or most people, their risk of a suicide attempt goes down by 50%. So really, really impressive. And I think that it really just drives home, like, these are folks who, especially when you think about like trans kids or trans teenagers who are just starting to go through puberty. When you're 8 and 9, I mean, everybody's body is essentially looks the same. You're kind of like, yes, you have the sex organs there, but they haven't really developed yet. And then you go through puberty, and all of a sudden, a little kid that has gender dysphoria, their body is like betraying them. It is changing in ways that almost no one likes puberty. Like, nobody would be like, oh, that was such a great time. Let's do that again, right? But now, like, think about going through like the wrong puberty. And so they feel so helpless and out of control. And the one thing that we can do potentially is just honor them. Honor their name, honor their pronouns. And we know now that it really, really can actually make a big difference. Similarly, this is the impact of support. And so this is kind of where they were able to put, kind of to qualify the level of support that they had, whether that was a friend or a special person or a family, and whether it was low or moderate support or high support. And that what they found was 13% of trans and non-binary youth with high levels of support attempted suicide versus 22% of those with low levels of support. So having people, having adults, or someone in their life who was affirming of their gender really does make a difference in terms of someone's mental health. So we talked a lot about gender, and we talked about sex. We'll also talk briefly about sexuality to kind of round out LGBTQ. And so most of these are probably things that maybe you're a little bit more familiar with. So the one that I would point out, I'll point out a couple of them. So homosexual is, I think, one that I would say that the thing I would say about labels is like people can choose any label that they want. Okay, so like if somebody says, I am a homosexual, you should say like, great, and you should refer to them as a homosexual. But what I would say is that probably you won't run across a lot of folks who use that term. And so if you're just kind of like giving or talking about like gay folks or LGBT folks, or I would say queer folks in general, I would not use the term homosexual. I would shy away from it. And so the reason being is that homosexuality, I think for lots of folks, just has very negative connotations. So I identify as gay, I identify as queer, I identify as a lesbian, I don't identify as homosexual. When I hear that term, I think of like people standing behind like religious pulpits or people standing on political stumps talking about things in a really, really negative way. Homosexuality was in the DSM, so that's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, kind of the psychiatric manual that lists out every mental health diagnosis. It was in there until the 4th edition, so up until 1973. So it was like a mental health diagnosis. So that's really what I think of with homosexual and homosexuality. Then we have something like pansexual. People will describe this sometimes as being like gender blind. If you went onto a dating app, you would sort of choose like all the genders, right? So like it's not necessarily that you would be attracted to someone of a particular gender, you would be attracted to a person. And they could be a trans man, a trans woman, a cis man, a cis woman, a non-binary person, kind of all of the above. Asexual is somebody who doesn't have a desire for sexual intimacy. They may have a desire for emotional connection, to have a companion, to have a partner, to look very much like anyone else in a relationship, just not really want to be sexually intimate. There are other ace people, you might sometimes hear them called ace too, other people who would identify as ace, and maybe they don't want any of that kind of, emotional or physical relationship with folks. So just like everything, there could be this spectrum. And then queer, I think that queer is like an interesting generational term. Younger people, like all of you, have like very, very, I think, successfully so, reclaimed this word queer and used it in a very empowering way. Queer, of course, for a very long time was used quite disparagingly. So not everyone may identify with it, but I would say that there are more and more folks who do. And I think that the thing that a lot of people love about queer is because remember how I talked about like we all have these like file cabinets in our brain and we want to categorize people by the labels that they give us. There's nothing like the middle finger to a label like the word queer. So like what does queer mean? I don't know. Queer means like whatever that person thinks that it means. So queer is in its truest sense like anyone who identifies as a gender or sexual minority. And I think that it can encompass like a whole bunch of stuff. So doesn't necessarily always talk about somebody's sexuality. It could talk about their gender some. Some people use it and they're very cisgender, but they're talking about their sexuality, so it could mean lots of things. And then questioning is just somebody who might be questioning what their sexuality is or sometimes what their gender is. And then the behavior stuff is kind of medical things that we would talk about. We often, a lot of what I teach when I talk to medical students or to residents or providers that are in practice is just trying to